The primary push coming from opposition in this round is that specialization leads to less accessibility. I think this is an extremely important point that even OG wasn't able to engage with. Let me explain to you why we've already proven coming from CG that specialization does indeed lead to more audience engagement and more accessible articles. So first on this point coming from closing opposition, where they say because journalists are overworked, they are not able to put out quality pieces in time, and therefore leads to lower quality of work that people aren't able to engage with. Let's break this down piece by piece. So, opening government's response to this point was that, oh, experts are able to push out work faster. And the closing op says that's not the point, that we need quality work to come out. But our response coming from closing government is very clear here, that quality work comes better if you know about the field more. Why is that? Because if you're pressed for time and you need to do research in order to put out good quality articles, if I have to read up about tariffs, for example, in order to put out a good quality article about the US putting tariffs on Russia, for example, it is far harder for me to put out quality work in a short amount of time compared to an expert who already knows about the intricacies and implications of a tariff on Russia, such as higher gas prices, for example, without having to do the hours of research that is needed in order to comprehend and write good articles. This is a response that comes exclusively coming from closing government, and I think already shuts down the majority of COKs. Coming from opening opposition, they also run on this case about failing to prove about why people will read specialist news to begin with, and how there's generally bias in like the academic field. And now I think this is a good point actually coming from opening opposition that OG isn't able to fully respond to. Because OG's point is that academic integrity exists in the field of professionals, for example, and therefore when they write articles, it will be simply be better. But I think the problem here is it doesn't account for the possibility that academics are often subject to biases themselves. Within the academic field, because they're invested within their research, they put in years of effort in their research, they're likely to overrepresent their ideas or be attached to their ideas and fields. Now, this is something that we will exclusively stop and respond to coming from closing government, preempting this from like opening op and like op bench case, further like proofing your case. And the point here being that if you are a journalist, for example, with expertise, but haven't necessarily opted into the field, you have less skin in the game to overrepresent certain ideas. What does this mean? It isn't necessarily true that you have biases as an individual, not because you're simply because an academic, but simply because you haven't put in years of research in terms of having like thesis or your PhD or your master's, for example, in these specific fields, they're likely to lead to biases in the first place. This is an extremely important point that is nuanced to the motion because we explicitly see in the motion that it talks about people with university or graduate level experience, not those with masters or doctorates that are likely to have more of the academic bias that opening op is describing. And therefore, I think this adequately responds to their point. But then coming again to closing opposition, where they tell us, oh, they're likely to have experts who failed in the field and therefore have the expertise needed to report, but are specialized in journalistic reporting. Now, this is like having their cake and eating it too, because the motion slide explicitly says that we're talking about people that have majored in journalism, meaning that they've spent their 4 years of college learning about writing, media, and communication, not people that have had prior experience. All the benefits they argue for failed experts that enter journalism are in fact examples of specialist journalists. So any benefit you get coming from this line of analysis coming from closing opposition is actually for closing government. And then lastly, like this idea about how journalists are able to, or how journalists aren't able to necessarily represent their ideas well if they aren't able to receive large amounts of academic or like journalistic training. Let's question this premise because what minimalistic journalistic training means is that they get the basics of ethics in journalism, for example, or simple tips for how to engage with the audience. And we think in terms of barrier to entry to journalism, this is only what you need in order to be able to adequately engage audiences. Why? Because as Steph already tells you, from primary school to secondary school to high school to college even, you're constantly refining and honing your writing skills. You need to do this for essays, for dissertations, to properly communicate your ideas to pass college and to get good grades. So everyone that graduates probably has some decent level of attainment in terms of writing skill. But going even further than that, we also already explained to you why if you become a journalist to begin with, you probably have better than average writing skills. Why? If I suck at writing, probably my top choice for a career isn't a career that will require me to write all the time. This means that by process of natural selection and just simply because of who the job will appeal to, the people that it appeals to, it is likely that they already have higher than average writing attainment, which means that when they do write articles, they probably already very engaging to begin with. But lastly, and the most important point I think in this response, is that on-the-job training exists. It is far easier to learn how to write and to communicate better over time and to communicate your points rather than learning a whole field from scratch. And we tell you that it's very important to know about the field that you're researching about, because a very important role of media is the interpretation role that media plays within society. It isn't just about informing, it's about using information to and boiling it down and talking about the consequences of that information for people on the ground. And I think the problem is generalist journalists aren't able to do that as well when they don't understand the implications of the information they have. But before I move on, I'll take a POI from closing.
Can you stop asserting that these guys are so qualified just based on the info slide? Thank you.
Okay, one, when we're talking about qualification in terms of educational attainment, it literally, when you have university level and when you have university level education, it entails that you've spent 4 years researching on the topic of your choice, which means you're likely to be capable of learning or like talking about it. But if we're talking about communication, I've already not asserted, I've already explain to you the process of how you're able to build up your writing attainment and how there are other alternatives to learn about writing later on. But sure, we're willing to trade off. Like, even if you get people that are slightly less skilled in terms of writing, what is the degree to which you're less skilled at writing? Because I think anyone that has passed college can probably still write articles that are understandable by the general masses. Even if it means that it isn't hyper engaging, I think sensationalist content that is fluff content and isn't able to dig into the intricacies of these topics as well as experts are able to, for the very same reason that you explain in CEO that they're probably overworked and don't have the time to do research on these things. I think less people is actually better if it means that less people opt into sensationalist media that leads to people making bad, misinformed decisions that create more harm than good. For example, in electorates or elections where bad politicians or leaders are chosen simply because they don't understand the implications of their decisions well. So for all these reasons, I think it's a very clear CG win. Thank you.